Good day, class. Once again, my name is Engineer Joshua, and today we're going to be looking at types of hazard. In our previous class, who can remind me of what we discussed about? We looked at the first lesson that has to do with occupational health and electrical workplace safety. We consider the concept of what? Hazard. So hazard, of course, we know is no hazard, literally the way we described it, no hazard, no accident. And we looked at the relationship between hazards, um, hazards, risk, incident. That is, that leads to what? Accident or near miss. Or near miss. So we looked at hazards, risk as it is, and what? The incidents that leads to what? The accident or near miss. Of course, we said when you are ready to take the risk, as the word there implies, then you're faced with what? Accident. So today we are going to be considering what I said is what? Types of hazard. What are the type of hazards? Of course, we're going to be looking at types of hazards, this example, and the effects on the human body or workers. We have what we refer to as what? Physical hazard. We have ergonomic hazard. Of course, we have psychological hazards. Psychological hazard. Yes. Environmental hazards is also a hazard. Environmental hazard. That is, we have it. This can encompass, because when we talked about environmental hazards, we can also look at what we refer to as what? Biological hazard. Biological hazards. Of course, radiations that have to do with electricity, like the arc flash. You have what? Radiation hazard. What referred to as what? Radiation hazard. In elaborating more on all these physical hazards, the hazards you see around the environment, we have wet floor. Wet floor can be what? An hazard. Wet floor. When the floor is wet, it is an hazard because it can what? Trips. It can trips. Then when it comes to being in the electrical department, when it now comes to what? Loose electrical cables. These are physical what? Hazards. Cables that roll on the floor, they can trips us as a trainee, even as a trainer, or a worker, if proper consideration is not taken. So when you say physical hazards, are those hazards that you can see but you ignore. When you not take the risk of getting yourself exposed to that hazard, then what we saw in the relationship, ignoring the hazards, then accidents occur. Then we have ergonomic hazard, like we said, ergonomic hazard. When you see ergonomic hazard, it has to do with sitting or lifting position. When you're sitting, you're not properly sitting as the chair is being what? Made. Or like you relax in the chair for too long, you stand for too long. This can harm the human body. It can cause pains. So, or lifting heavy objects, literally you just pick an object like that, you feel the pain from the back. That is what we know as what? Ergonomics. Ergonomics hazard is, we're going to be looking at the course of this module, lifting techniques, how you can lift objects safely without harming, most especially, your back. So ergonomic has to do with sitting, lifting objects, stretching the body in a way that is not supposed to be. This can lead to what? Twisting of the body. Like I said, like you're sitting, if you don't sit upright the way the chair is being made, you start feeling what? The effect. Take for instance, there was a time I was into this, most especially bead making. There are situations you just sit for too long while you were using your hands to do some works. Before you know it, you start feeling pains from the chest around you. But unknowingly to you, you won't remember or try to figure out that it is that job that you have been doing for some time that is causing the chest pain or what? The back pain. So all these things must have what? Limits. It's a hazard. It's a hazard that you don't see, but you begin to feel the effects because as a result of poor, maybe sitting arrangement, poor posture of your body, standing for too long, sitting awkwardly for too long. It's what we refer to as what? Ergonomic hazard. Psychological hazard. That is when you are scared psychologically. Fright. You know, there are some persons that can, like now, if I say, okay, you go get a ladder, go and climb this height. Sometimes even you're like, sir, I can't. Sir, no, I'm scared of height. That is psychologically, you have defeated yourself before carrying out the act. Then you see some persons like I'm talking, maybe there is a sharp noise, sound. You just, hey, what is that? These are psychological effects. It makes you fear. Makes you fear. That is the right word, literal word. Fear can cause, even in real life situations. Sometimes there are some human beings that have high BP. They will say you don't shout around them because it can lead to what? Increase of the blood pressure. So it's psychological effect. Look at Tony as an electrical technician or aspiring, just like you are. You ask to go to a tunnel and make some connections, carry out electrical work. You know, I will enter inside this tunnel. Those are psychological hazard. And by the time you see yourself going to do that hard, it can lead to something else that can affect your health. That is why it's part of the types of hazards that you consider. Hazard is everywhere in whatever we do. But recognizing it makes you take care of it. And if you are ready to face the risk, you must be fully ready so that to avoid. That is why we said from the accidents or near miss, there are sometimes you escape that incident. So we need to put into consideration whenever we are carrying out any work we're asked to do. First, look around. I say, hey, Ameka, go and power that switch. Of course, you see a naked a switch that is not properly connected. Then you just rush and without looking for what? The source. If it is properly connected or is exposed to electric shock, you must carry out, as an electrical personnel, you must look carefully to avoid what? Shock. Then that is where we lead to environment. Environmental hazard. You looked at the room temperature. Is it conducive? Just as we had now. Is this room conducive? Can I stay here for like 2-3 hours? Some persons, if this temperature, the environment is hot now, some of you can start finding yourself and like, sir, this thing is not conducive for me. It's hazard. Because it's not everybody that can withstand hot environment. Likewise, it has to do with cold. Temperature has to do with the hotness. and what? The coolness of the environment. So there should be a proper ventilation, no contaminated air. So you looked at all these things. Then that is where the environment comes in. Then you looked at some hazardous substances around us, chemicals that can affect our health. As an electrical personnel, sometimes these symptoms of smell, if you don't have it, you can encounter problem. If you don't have it, so not many of us have that. Some of us are sick of not being able to smell. And of course, the first thing when you considering troubleshooting in an electrical is the smell. It has a unique smell. Electrical cable or materials has this unique smell. That is where you detect that, oh, something is burning somewhere. What could that be? So you must take into consideration of all this. Then we looked at like the biological, we looked at what's your health situation, the hepatitis B, like now what is going on now, this COVID-19. COVID-19, these are things that what can spread on air. So you take into consideration. If you discover somebody is coughing frequently, sneezing and all that, what is the symptom of that? That is one of the symptoms of what? Coronavirus, COVID-19. Well, you are expected to what? Protect yourself with face masks and take consideration. Keep distance. So these are biological what? Hazards. It goes here. Then we looked at radiation hazard as it concerns us. Basically, this is very, very important to electrical personnel. Radiation hazard. Because sometimes we say there are some accidents, we say out of God. It just happened. Like a situation of arc flash in electrical what? Materials. Once it flashes, it can cause laceration, burning of the skin, and of course, once it is done, there's no turning back. We need to be very, very careful as an electrical personnel so that we're able to work freely. The issue of electric wedding, arc wedding, too much looking with your naked eyes can damage the eyes. It is radiations. As it sparks, you feel the effects on your naked eyes. That is why you have to be what? Protected. We're going to be looking at, in subsequent lessons, protective gadgets that we can use in carrying out our jobs. Now, hazards as it is. These and many more you can see in some persons when you talked about hazards, types of hazards, it can come to be tripping or wet flow and all that. But this is basically the types which has a lot of all these activities around us that can lead to what? Accidents. But as it concerns us most, as an electrical personnel, we're going to be looking at hazards of in a what? Electricity. Electricity. Electrical hazards, so to say. So let's look at hazard of what? Electricity. That is where it concerns us most. Hazards of what? Electricity. Basically, when we say hazards of electricity, we are talking about what you encounter in carrying out your electrical work, what you encounter. But if care is taken, you will be able to carry out your job perfectly without being involved in what? In accidents. First hazard we consider when it comes to what? Electricity is what? Shock. Shock. When we say shock, What does it mean? What does it mean when you talk about shock? How many of you have not received shock before in your life? Like I always say, if you are fit to be in this class, which means you must have passed through shock in one way or the other. It doesn't necessarily mean it must be electricity what? Shock. There are some shock you imbibe to your body. You just have to tease, which is though wrong, not to carry out, but it is a tinkling sensation you feel. It is a tinkling sensation. Most common and can cause what? Electrocution. This shock can lead to what? Electrocution. This shock can lead to what? Electrocution. That is the death effect. That is the effect as a result of what? Death. But this is where people normally looked at. When you say electrocuted, I was electrocuted. Oh, no. You receive what? Shock. When it comes to electrocution, that means the person is what? Is dead. You're not alive to narrate the story. Except an observer, somebody at the scene will narrate right on the situation. You can always narrate when it has to do with what? Shock. Okay? So shock, as I said, is a tickling sensation that affects our muscle. It contracts the muscle, leading to what? Injuries. Sometimes you receive a shock, that part of the body, that part that you make contact, that you make contact with the electricity, you see that part, it looks as if it's dead. Take, for instance, maybe you mistakenly, sometimes sharp event, we try to just quickly pull our hands, the pot with our bare hand. Just pull a pot from fire with your bare hand. Before you know it, you start feeling that part to be like no blood flow. That is how the effect of shock is in the body. Of course, electricity, like we said, what does it transfer? It transfers what? Heat through medium. Okay? So injuries like shock can occur. Secondary injuries can be what for? You can be walking on a height and you make contact with electricity, you receive shock, current entered your body, receive shock. That shock can just displace you from your position and you fall. That is another one, secondary effect of it. Then another hazard as a result of electricity is fire. Fire. Because, like I said, heat is being transferred. Electricity transfer heat. And that is why I always say the bigger the size of cable, the more heat that is being transferred within the cable. So once there is a supply, it transfers it. So once it comes to an extent, maybe the cable is not too big, it's not big enough to carry the current. If the heat is transferred is more than enough, or there is a spark along the line, it can what? Ignite. Especially when it has to do with what? Combustible material. Materials that can what? That can burn. So once that heat, for a long time, heat is passing through a cable or a process like extensions and all that, if you don't stop it, it will result to what? To fire. That is, you are not using what the material you expected to use so that you arrive at the conclusion or the work you want to achieve, whatever you want to achieve, can be a hazard and can cause what? Fire. So when it comes to electricity, care should be, apart from the shock, which has to do with the human body, that you receive the shock, fire of the material. You need to consider fire, because once it starts burning, it's not easy to put off electrical fire, because water is not what? Advisable to put off fire. Then we looked at what? Explosion. Another hazard. What is explosion? Electrical spark can ignite vapors in the what? In the air. In the air. Of course, you see, but basically, we use overhead in our environment. You've seen that our cables, overhead cables, sometimes, if they're especially during the rainy season, if the winds can make two cables meet, and there is always what? A spark. Of course, as you hear sound, at times there is sound that goes with that spark. You hear boom. Basically, we just say, transformer has damage. All these things as a resultant effect of explosion. Once it explodes, it can lead to what? Damage of equipment or materials. Then we looked at another effect that has to do with what? The arc flash. What is arc flash? These are like explosion, but it's like a spark. Like a spark. It can cause burns ranging from what? 14,000 degrees. The heat Fahrenheit to 35,000 degrees Fahrenheit. That is, arc flash can lead to what? 14,000 degree Fahrenheit. Fahrenheit to what? 35,000 Fahrenheit. That is the range of the heat it can cause. Sometimes, like I said, it's not usually a fault of the operator. Maybe you want to go and switch and because of lack of maintenance of equipment. You just hear boom. That blast is as a result of the effect of the arcing. And they will refer to that as what? Arc blast. Refer to that as what? Arc blast. If that is short circuit, when there is a result of such circuit event, copper, it can expand the copper materials. It can expand as more than 67,000 times. The expansion causes a pressure wave. Here can also expand, adding to the pressure wave of the hard glass. So we need to be very, very careful. And of course, what are the resultant effects of this if you come across it or if you see it? Like we said, bonds. We're going to see in some of the course of these lessons those effects on human being. Like basically, as a technician or electrical personnel, we normally hands and the face, because basically, like the arc flash, arc blast scenario, usually you encounter it in your face, your hand, because it is the hand usually used to what? Carry out your job. So you see the effects on our hand. Then you looked at shock as one of these. Like I said, it leads to what? Burn of the skin or laceration. Fire itself can burn the material or the components. Then it can also as well lead to electrocution, like we have said. Then explosion. Like then how does this shock occur? How does shock occur? Who knows? Shock occurs in different ways. Shock can occur like current travels in a closed circuit. When the current travels in a closed circuit through a conductor, if you make contact with that conductor, you receive shock. Water also is a substance that carries what? Electricity. Although, like we've read somewhere, they said pure water. Pure water is a bad conductor. But like I always say, water is a good conductor. that carries, because you can't determine when the water is pure. And of course, electricity flows through water very easily. So water also is a substance that transfer electricity from one part to another. Of course, matter. And of course, the human body. The human body is a very good conductor of electricity because our body contains what? Salt and water, impurities. So when the current enters basically through our hand, our head make contact, especially when you are walking on overhead or at the height, you make contact with electricity, you receive shock. So one of the ways is through making contact with current that is traveling through a substance or materials. And also, shock occurs when the body becomes part of what? The circuit. When the body becomes part of the circuit, shock can occur. Current will enter through basically our hands when you're carrying out the job. Current pass through your hands and it will leave through the ground. When there is easy access, you will receive a shock. So in three ways that shock occurs, that we make contact with the conductors, like I said, making contact with conductors, contact with one conductor and what? The ground. Then of course with two, contact with live metals. Contact with live metals can lead to what? Shock when you receive. So when you are walking, be careful that you don't make contact with electricity or naked cable, materials that can lead to what? Accidents. It occurs through contact, contact with live metal parts. We say it occurs through um, conducting materials, through what? Through ground. Then, the shock effect we are talking about, what is the amount of current that can lead to shock? The amount of current that can lead to shock is basically not necessarily what we used to hear. It is a tinkling sensation, like I said. 1 milliamps. 1 milliamp current leads to shock. Can lead to shock. 1 milliamps. Once there is a flow, you make contact, it leads to shock. But it's not enough to electrocute, but you must receive a shock. So severity of the shock, it now depends on what? What is the severity of the shock? When you receive a shock, how do you determine if it's going to be, it affects you as a human or electrical personnel? It's being considered as severity of the shock. Severity of the shock. Severity of the shock depends on one, amount of current. Amount of current that enters the body is determined by the voltage and what? Resistance. It's determined by voltage and resistance. So when you make contact, before you can feel the effect, it must be an amount of current that is large enough to what? To see the physical what? Effects on the body. Other effects, severity of it has to do with the path through which the body make contact. The path through body. Okay? The part of flow. That is, at times, basically with our hands, when you make contact with your hand, it flows easily and faster. Sometimes, as electrical personnel, in rare cases, your head basically is a hand. So the part of flow through the body determines severity. Another factor we looked at is the duration of flow through the body. Duration of flow. Duration of flow through the body. There are some, like I always say in a simple language, that there are some types, amount of current that freezes the human body. It attracts, it makes you hang. That is why you see some scenario, somebody make contact with electricity, you just cannot let go. If nobody is there to isolate or to rescue such a victim, the person would have died before maybe you make arrangements for somebody that will come and rescue. So such a situation is that the time it takes, there are some currents you make contact with, it will just look as if it hits repair. It will repair. Then you are lucky for such situations. So it's another determinant of the severity of shock. Then we looked at other factors such as health situation, general health situation. Let me put it that way. General health situations, because not too many of us are okay. Like somebody that is hypertensive, once you make contact, it will affect more. Once you make contact, it will affect more. So we need to be prepared when carrying out electrical work. You consider these four factors, like I said, amount of current that enters the body or you make contact with, then the paths through which the flow of current through the body, then duration, that is the time it takes you to make contact, and of course, the general health situation. Some persons cannot be feeling fine. Of course, a wet hand person will receive more shock than the dry skin person. For a dry skin person, he or she has what? High resistance compared to a wet skin person. Some persons frequently they can feel wet when in the palm. You can feel wet all the time, especially during the Harmattan season. Once you wet and you make contact with electricity, the severity will be more compared to what a dry skin situation. When we are to come for the practical sessions, we'll see demonstrations of such scenario. When we do some demonstration, then when it comes to the practical sessions, we'll see how the difference between a wet skin person and a dry skin person, the resultant effect when you make contact with the same amount of what? Current. So like I always say, low voltage does not mean low hazard. We had to put all these things into consideration so that we survive while doing our job, and if for nothing but for our family sake. So that is the end of this lesson. But of course, from what we have discussed so far, you will understand that we looked at the topic before us was types of what? Hazards. In the types of hazards, we looked at various types of hazards, which we said we have environmental hazards, we have biological hazards, we have radiation hazard, we have environmental hazards, we have even hazards electricity that has to do with the effect of shock. What shock? So what are hazards of electricity? We said hazards of electricity has to do with what? The shock itself, the fire that can burn materials, and of course, even our skins. And we looked at the arc flash, we looked at the arc blast, and of course, the physical hazards, like we said, like the wet environment, cables littering all over the floor, walkways, doorways, and all that, if not properly installed. Then lifting every object, like we have said, stretching the body unnecessarily. All these are hazards, are types of hazards that we need to put into consideration for us to work safely. Thank you very much. And the next lesson, we should be considering causes of hazard. Thank you as we put an end to